Morning, folks, and welcome to today's episode called BlockBuster, the men and moments behind its rise and fall. And there are so many great characters in this story. I dig into the founder, David Cook, a guy who sold the business for $12 million but could have made $300 million if he just held on to it for a few more years. And then Wayne Huizenga, the guy who turbocharged the business after building his first fortune in the rough and tumble waste management business of the 70s and 80s. Then there's the legendary meeting where BlockBuster's executives had the chance to buy a fledgling company called Netflix for just $50 million, but they more or less laughed the Netflix founders out of the room. And then, as I've come to expect, and probably we've all come to expect, Carl Icahn makes an appearance and bullies his way into the business, but makes a complete mess of it. It is a cracking story. Enjoy. So the story of BlockBuster, it starts with David Cook. He was a data analyst who, back in the 70s and early 80s, was the owner of a company called Cook Data Services. It was a software and data company based in Texas, and he developed complicated software that helped oil and gas companies, I suppose, make sense of their data. And he was doing pretty well. By 1982, the company was pulling in over $6 million a year in sales. And then in 1983, he took the company public. The IPO brought in $8.4 million. And now with all this cash, Cook was going to use it to fund his expansion. But then the oil market collapsed. Due to a combination of things, there was a lot of new oil production coming in from places like Alaska and the North Sea, and at the same time, a global recession just killed off demand. So Cook's customers started cutting costs really quickly and cancelling contracts, and he was left with practically no customers. But he did have the $8.4 million from the IPO he just raised, so he needed to pivot. And being the data analyst that he was, he started researching potential opportunities. And in his own words, we had three criteria. 1, a fragmented market without dominant players. 2, a business that could be set up locally and easily replicated. And 3, a business where we could throw up some competitive barriers. And around this time, the home video market was taken off. Like, industry revenues had gone from about $1 billion to nearly $4 billion in just 2 years. And Cook's research told him that most stores were small, independent, mom and pop type operations with limited stock, clunky checkout systems, and a poor customer experience. Each video cassette cost about $70 from distributors, so stores, they could only afford a handful of new releases. Cook's initial instinct was to join an existing franchise called VideoWorks. This was a growing regional video rental franchise in Texas. And like almost all video stores of that time, their locations were small, badly lit, not very user-friendly. And then when Cook's wife suggested that their own franchise be painted in a bright blue and yellow colour scheme, VideoWorks wouldn't allow it. So Cook decided to go out on his own. On October 19th, 1985, he opened the first BlockBuster video store in Dallas, Texas. And it's fair to say that he got it pretty much right from the get-go. Like, the store had over 10,000 tapes. That was more than 3 times what even the largest stores at that time carried. Each tape and membership card had a barcode scanned at the checkout, which then fed into a live database so they could track what people rented and predict demand. To prevent theft, each tape had a magnetic strip linked to sensors at the door. And I know all of this sounds ordinary now, but in 1985, in the video rental market, this was all pretty revolutionary. And the design of the store, with bright yellow and blue colours, it was clean, well lit, with rows and rows of tapes displayed openly so customers could easily browse. Again, so different to the little pokey outlets that dominated the sector everywhere. I remember it well in my local town in Abbeyfield, just across the Kerry border in Ireland. We had 3 small pokey video shops with a tiny selection. Like, the chances of getting a new release was slim to none. Cook kept the store open until midnight, 7 days a week. Rentals ran on a 3-day cycle, and that encouraged people to take a few movies at a time. A lot of people would rent out 3 or 4 movies at the same time. And crucially, there were no adult films, and that was very deliberate. It created this family-friendly environment, and it gave BlockBuster instant credibility with mainstream America. On the first day of opening, they were so mobbed they had to lock the doors to stop more people from coming in. So the demand was pretty obvious, and within 2 years, Cook had 15 company-owned stores and 20 franchise locations. And as a result, he spent $6 million building a central distribution warehouse. Now, to fund further expansion, Cook planned a public offering in September 1986. Everything was lined up to go until a financial journalist published a piece questioning the company's prospects, and also highlighted Cook's background in the collapsed oil industry and said he lacked the experience in the video rental business. I thought that was very, very unfair, because Cook had done nothing wrong, especially in relation to the oil business. The sector just went under. And when you consider that the video rental business was an entirely new sector, nobody could claim to have sector-specific experience. But the article was enough to scare investors off, and the IPO was cancelled, and so Cook had to look for outside investors. And it was then that he was introduced to the second other important person in the BlockBuster story, Wayne Huizenga. So let's take a look at Huizenga. He is a fascinating character. So he was born in 1937 in Chicago, but was raised in Fort Lauderdale in Florida. And by all accounts, he had a very, very tough upbringing. His father was physically abusive, his mother was emotionally fragile, and in his own words, his childhood was miserable, chaotic, and dangerous. In his teens, Huizenga worked in construction, he attended college but dropped out, he served 6 months in the military, and then he began selling trash hauling services door to door. Now, waste was a business that ran in the family. His grandfather and other relatives had waste businesses in Chicago. And then in 1962, when he was 25 years old, he saw a local waste collection business come up for sale. It was a small business, just 1 truck. Huizenga approached the owner and said he wanted to buy it, but he didn't have the money. And the owner must have seen something in him, because he agreed to sell Huizenga the business on credit. And Huizenga worked like a demon. He'd get up at 2 a.m, he'd run his route until noon, then he'd go home for a quick shower, put on a suit, and then spend the rest of the day knocking on doors and pitching new customers. By 1969, 7 years into the business, he'd 40 trucks and revenues of $3 million. But to grow the business bigger, he needed partners. So he teamed up with a few other waste businesses in Chicago. Remember, his family were from there. One of them was run by a guy called Dean Buntrock, who was married to one of Huizenga's cousins. And they renamed the business Waste Management Inc., or WMI. And Buntrock and Huizenga, they made a great partnership. Buntrock was the methodical, strategic one, while Huizenga was this relentless deal maker. And from the outset, their goal was to go national, to scale. And for that, they'd need capital. So, in 1971, WMI went public, and with the money that they'd raised from that, they went on a buying spree. And their timing, it was really good, because a lot of new strict regulations were brought into the waste sector in the early 70s. And unlike a lot of the smaller waste management companies, which were family owned, WMI had the resources now to build state-of-the-art landfills and chemical waste facilities, and they also had the resources to buy up these smaller local businesses. So they acquired 130 operations in 19 states. Revenue hit $82 million within just 2 years of the IPO. Now, of course, when I say family-run waste businesses, The Sopranos jumps into my mind, and there were plenty of unproven rumours back then about WMI's links to the mob. Now, these rumours were unproven, and there was no suggestion that Huizenga or his partners were in any way tied to the mob. But there's little doubt that as Huizenga built the WMI business, he would have had a lot of dealings with people who had ties to the mob. So Huizenga would have had to be a pretty formidable character to navigate his way through this business. And WMI themselves weren't squeaky clean. In 1976, the SEC accused the company of making improper political payments in Florida. That case was settled. Also, despite WMI's investments in state-of-the-art landfills, they continued to get into trouble with authorities for disposal of dangerous chemical waste and other infractions. And they had to settle various cases linked to overstating profits, fiddling expenses, and again, a lot of this can be traced back to the fact that many of the businesses they bought had been operating, I suppose you could say, in the shadows. But none of it slowed their momentum. By 1984, WMI had become the largest waste company in America. Huizenga was 47, at the absolute peak of his career, running a $3 billion company he'd built from nothing. But then, suddenly, he quit. Now, officially, he said he was tired of commuting between his home in Fort Lauderdale and the Chicago headquarters. But the real reason I found out was twofold. First of all, he wasn't happy with how much he had made from WMI. I could only find one source that mentioned Huizenga left WMI with $23 million in stock and options. So, I mean, that's a lot of money back then. But not as much maybe as you'd expect for someone who'd helped build what was now a $3 billion company. And maybe not as much for somebody who was as hungry as Huizenga, because here's a quote from his partner, Dean Buntrock. Wayne always keeps the carrot far enough out in front of him, and he never really wants to catch it. He's never satisfied. But the second reason he left WMI was because after years of buying companies and doing deals all over the country, the company had sort of plateaued. Huizenga's work now involved reports, bureaucracy. So he'd gotten bored, because what Huizenga loved more than anything else was doing deals. As we can tell from this very kind of disturbing quote from Huizenga, a deal is like chasing a girl. You work at it until she says yes, and then you keep putting pressure on them. Hit them right between the eyes, you kill them. I mean, Jesus, Wayne, I know things were different back in the 70s and 80s, but what the hell? Anyway, he left WMI, set up Huizenga Holdings, a private investment firm, and he was looking for opportunities. So when one of his colleagues came to him with the proposal to invest in BlockBuster, for Huizenga, this was a perfect business, because in many ways it mirrored the waste business when he first got started, in that it had recurring revenue and customers. It was in a fragmented industry where most owners were small, local. So Huizenga knew that with enough money and the right vision or formula, the sector was ripe for consolidation. And he could also see that Cook had exactly the right idea with his large, well-branded, family-friendly stores. So in 1987, a year after Cook had to pull his planned IPO, Huizenga, together with a few other investors, put $18.6 million into the business for a controlling stake, and Huizenga became chairman and CEO. Now, Huizenga wanted to go big much faster than Cook. He wanted to borrow heavily, open tons of company-owned stores, blitzing new markets before anybody else could catch up. Cook was more cautious by nature, and so within 2 months of Huizenga's investment, Cook sold his remaining shares for about $12 million and left the business. Now, of course, if Cook had held on to those shares, they would have been worth almost $300 million within a few years. But I found out that Cook did all right for himself. In 1998, he founded a company called Zixcore that focused on email security, and his investors included Bill Gates, Jack Welch of GE, and Michael Dell. And in 2021, that company was sold for $860 million. Now, Cook keeps a very, very low profile, so it was difficult to find any information on him, so I have no idea how much Cook earned from this, but it's fair to say that he did pretty well for himself. What's also really interesting about Cook, and what I like about him, is that he didn't have any bitterness about selling out early from BlockBuster. He didn't hold any resentment towards Wayne Huizenga taking over the business and growing it nationally. This is a quote from him. "I haven't found anyone who doesn't think BlockBuster did a whole lot better under Wayne, including me. And Huizenga, to his credit, he praised Cook for laying the foundation of BlockBuster's success. Here's a quote from him. David Cook came up with a wonderful concept. All we had to do was take that concept and build a cookie cutter system to copy it over and over again. And that's exactly what Huizenga does. Like at one point, they're opening up a new store every 24 hours. Within just over a year, they have 400 stores nationwide, and BlockBuster is by far the biggest video rental chain in America. They hit the market at just the right time with just the right product. By 1990, it had 1,200 stores in the US. By 1993, it's gone global. Over 3,600 stores, including in Canada, the UK, Australia, Japan, across Latin America. Annual revenue is up at $3 billion. It diversifies into video games and music. I wasn't aware of that, because in 1992 and 1993, Huizenga went on this retail spending spree, buying over 500 standalone music stores, and in doing so, BlockBuster became the third largest music retailer in the world. And then Huizenga goes off and buys himself more or less a trophy case of sports teams. He buys the Florida Marlins baseball team, the Florida Panthers national hockey team, and then the Miami Dolphins football team. For a time, he's the only person in history who owns 3 teams in 3 major US sports. So, as you can imagine, by 1993, BlockBuster was the most talked about and lauded business in the financial press, while Huizenga himself became, this media darling. Forbes, Fortune, Time, they're all over him. He's this billionaire who's at the very top of his game. And to all intents and purposes, BlockBuster was here to stay. That blue and yellow store becomes part of suburban life, as familiar as McDonald's golden arches. And for families all over the world, BlockBuster, it really does become this Friday night ritual. And that's probably why, for a lot of people my age, there's a lot of nostalgia linked to BlockBuster. Friday nights, the smell of the popcorn machine, arguing with your siblings or your roommates over which movie to pick. I can still picture it. But the thing is that while BlockBuster was at its pinnacle, Huizenga was looking at emerging technologies. Cable companies, telecom giants, early satellite providers, they were all beginning to pilot early blueprints for video on demand. And Huizenga started to get nervous, because if these new technologies actually took off, the brick and mortar video store would be in deep, deep trouble. So, very fortuitously for Huizenga, enter stage right Viacom. So this was Sumner Redstone's media company that owned MTV, Nickelodeon, Showtime, and of course, Redstone also owned National Amusements, a private theatre company controlling nearly 1,000 screens. So if you go back and listen to our episode on Redstone, you'll know that in September 1993, he'd gotten into this huge and very public and very exciting bidding war with Barry Diller to buy Paramount Studios. It is a cracking story, but the long and the short of it is that Redstone was under big pressure. He needed more cash to sweeten his deal, and BlockBuster was a cash cow. So Redstone swooped, bought BlockBuster for $8.4 billion. The deal was done quickly, quietly, like it caught everyone in the media business by surprise. And now, with BlockBuster's cash machine in hand, Redstone upped his bid and won the battle for Paramount. In the immediate aftermath, the press crowned Redstone the winner. But with hindsight, seeing how Viacom never really reached its potential as a vertical model, making movies and then distributing them through their own cinemas, their video stores and TV channels, that didn't really materialise. The real winner here was Huizenga. He cashed in at exactly the right moment and at exactly the right price, because in Redstone, he'd found a buyer who wasn't thinking really about BlockBuster's long-term viability. Redstone just wanted an immediate, cash-rich business to fund his fight for Paramount. As one industry insider said about Huizenga's timing, he's getting a price today that might not be there tomorrow. Now, after the deal, Huizenga steps back as CEO of BlockBuster and becomes vice chairman of the board of Viacom. But, as you'd expect, Huizenga, by this stage, he's too big a player to stay second in command to anyone. So he leaves within a year, cashing out to the tune of $670 million. And again, he follows the same pattern. He's looking to invest in a fragmented sector, and he finds it in the used car business. There's lots of small dealers, underfunded car lots, a lot of dissatisfied customers who hated haggling. So he bought into a tiny fledgling used car company called AutoNation. He scaled it aggressively, car superstores, fixed no haggle pricing. Wall Street loved it. He floated it, used the rising stock to buy up rival dealerships, rental car companies, a finance arm, and within a few years, AutoNation became the fastest growing company in America. By 1999, it was pulling in over $20 billion a year in revenue. Now, Huizenga himself stepped away from the business in 2003, sold his shares, and today, AutoNation is still the biggest car dealership group in America. Huizenga's last remaining business by this stage was the Miami Dolphins, and he sold that in 2008 for $1.1 billion, 7 times what he paid. By this stage, he had a net worth of $3 billion, and he retired to his huge waterfront estate in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, playing golf, collecting antique cars, giving money away to charity, before he passed away in 2018 at the age of 80. And what a legacy. He built 3 multi-billion-dollar businesses. That is a remarkable achievement. But this isn't all his story. This is BlockBuster's. So let's see how BlockBuster is doing. After the Viacom deal, it's still growing internationally, but the pace slows. Same-store rentals flatten out. Cable pay-per-view is nibbling away at the market. And also there's a very obvious change in mood music within the company, from Huizenga's entrepreneurial style to Viacom, which has a more stodgy corporate style. Then, in September 1997, 2 guys named Reed Hastings and Mark Randolph launch a new company called Netflix. Their idea is to rent DVDs by mail. Hastings said that the reason he started the company was because he really resented BlockBuster's late fee charges. And for our younger listeners, these late fees were a real pain in the ass to everyone who rented videos back then. But it was a huge earner for BlockBuster. It was estimated at its peak to bring in about $800 million a year annually. So that was just pure profit. So Netflix's business model includes no due dates, no late fees. By the end of 1998, Netflix is around 250,000 subscribers. So compared to BlockBuster's tens of millions of weekly customers, it's niche, it's tiny. Then in September 2000, the Netflix founders arranged a meeting with BlockBuster in Dallas to pitch a merger. And the idea was simple. Netflix would run the online rentals, BlockBuster would handle the physical stores, and Hastings' price was $50 million. And Hastings recalls that the BlockBuster CEO at the time and his executives didn't take Netflix seriously at all. And here's a quote from Hastings. They thought we were a joke. Now, this is one of those moments that it only becomes legendary with hindsight, because to be fair to BlockBuster, the Netflix guys weren't selling or pitching the future of media as such. They weren't pitching a streaming company. They were pitching an online DVD rental company with just 300,000 customers by this stage, $5 million in revenue, and losses of $10 million a year. And they had no real proprietary technology really to speak of. So my take on this is the mistake BlockBuster made here wasn't really rejecting Netflix specifically. It was rejecting the direction the entire industry was heading in. Because you could say at the time that, Netflix was just renting DVDs. But also, and crucially, what Netflix was selling was convenience. And that thinking, making it as easy as possible for people to access movies, that is exactly what led Netflix into streaming a few years later. And so by turning its back on the convenience model that consumers were moving towards, BlockBuster locked itself into a model that needed people to physically drive to a store. And as a result, well before streaming was launched, online retailers like Netflix were eating into Blockbuster's dominance. And it's not surprising because Blockbuster had become this slow, lumbering retailer, and it took them until 2004, 4 years after Netflix had proposed a merger, for Blockbuster to launch their own online service, and they basically just copied Netflix's subscription model. But by then, Netflix already had a serious head start. They now had 2.6 million customers, over 500 million in annual revenue, and there were other similar services like Redbox and LoveFilm in Europe. Blockbuster, meanwhile, by this stage, had lost its spark. Franchisees were complaining that stores felt tired because there was no investment being made into them. Its retail revenue was dropping, profits were way down. And then, in late 2004, Carl Icahn, the famous or infamous corporate raider, became Blockbuster's biggest shareholder, and he immediately started to fall out with Blockbuster's leadership over strategy. Because one of the big issues was the late fees. As mentioned, at its peak, Blockbuster's late fees had pulled in $800 million in gross revenue. But by now, the market had changed significantly. The very idea of penalising your customers, the people who were paying you for your service, that no longer flew. Customers just weren't willing to put up with it anymore. So when Blockbuster's leadership pushed to kill off the late fees and pour money into fighting Netflix online, Icahn went ballistic, because to an old school Wall Street activist like Icahn, the profits from those late fees were high margin, pure gold. To him, it looked like financial madness. But in January 2005, Blockbuster finally did kill off the late fees. It was the right move, but it came far too late. And it came at a time when they could least afford to lose those profits. Now, Icahn eventually forced out the leadership, brought in a new CEO. The strategy now became to stop the expensive online digital expansion, bring back the lucrative late fees, but the horse had already bolted there, cut corporate overheads to the bone, and milk the retail stores for immediate cash flow to boost the stock price. And the result of this strategy was an unmitigated disaster, because by focusing on the retail outlets only and having no digital plan, Icahn left Blockbuster completely defenceless just as high-speed broadband arrived and Netflix launched its streaming service. And then 2009 hit. The economy's in recession, DVD sales are tanking, and Netflix's streaming numbers are soaring with over 12 million subscribers, 1.6 billion in revenue, and by the year end, Blockbuster shares are trading at 50 cents. On September 23rd, 2010, Blockbuster filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, with Carl Icahn saying, "Blockbuster was the worst investment I ever made." Now, a company called Dish Network bought Blockbuster out of bankruptcy for $320 million. They liquidated all their assets, they closed all the stores, except for one independent franchise in a town called Bend in Oregon, and the owners simply refused to close. And today, it's essentially a pop culture pilgrimage site. People fly in from all over the world just to stand under the blue and yellow sign and to take a selfie. And it's also an Airbnb, so fans can book a 90s themed sleepover inside the store. Now, as for the rise and fall of Blockbuster, it's a pretty obvious cautionary tale of how technology and disruption can kill even the biggest businesses in a very, very short space of time. But it also shows just how important leadership is. It was obvious then, and it's even more obvious now, that Blockbuster needed to cannibalise its own business if it wanted to survive. But that takes a strong leader, someone with real conviction and vision, a leader willing to say, this is going to hurt us in the short term, but if we don't do it, someone else will. Steve Jobs did exactly that with the iPhone. The iPhone cannibalised the iPod, which was Apple's best-selling product at that time. Netflix did the same. They cannibalised their own DVD by mail business when they launched their streaming service. But what I really loved about the Blockbuster story was learning about David Cook and Wayne Huizenga, two brilliant entrepreneurs who, between them, built something that was of its time. And for a lot of people my age, Blockbuster is such a nostalgic business. I still remember my first trip to a Blockbuster. The selection, it was huge compared to what I was used to. The size of the store, just slowly working my way down the aisles with this huge wall of choice in front of me. And I love movies. I used to buy Empire magazine every month. So Blockbuster in its early years, like for me, it was a place of joy. It was brilliant. And I think it's those memories, together with the founder stories, Cook and Husinga, that make it such a great story. And that brings us to listeners' emails. And this one comes from Jim, who'd love me to cover the life and times of Edmund Safra. He's the Lebanese billionaire banker who died in a fire in his apartment in Monaco in 1999. And there was some mystery around that as well. Excellent suggestion, Jim. Thanks so much. And also thanks for listening. And remember, if you have any comments, any corrections, or any story ideas, email me at info@gbspod.com. All the best, folks.